Today's episode is brought to you by poet, playwright, performance artist, and translator Ariana Rain's new collection of poems, A Sand Book, out June 18th from Tin House Books and available now for pre-order. A Sand Book migrates from wildfires to hurricanes, Tweety Bird to the president, lust to aridity, desertification to prophecy, and mother to daughter. Kim Gordon calls it mind-blowing, and Booklist's starred review says that Rain's wildly rewarding poems are connected through clarity of voice, generous irreverence, and seemingly limitless purview. It truly contains multitudes. Rain's fans have been waiting 8 years for a new book, and this one is sure not to disappoint. Before we begin today's episode with Miriam Toews, I would be remiss to not mention that the last and final issue of Tin House Magazine's 20-year run is now out and available. One of the options for supporters of the show is to sign up for a back issue bundle and receive 3 back issues of the magazine. This, or a copy of Kristen Arnett's Mostly Dead Things, or Morgan Parker's Magical Negro, or Ursula K. Le Guin's Conversations on Writing, to name just a few of the gifts available. Access to the bonus audio archive as well, where Miriam Toews is adding a reading of the Coleridge poem from which she took the phrase, "all my puny sorrows," for one of her novels. This can all be found at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. Enjoy today's program. Good morning and welcome to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's guest is the writer Miriam Toews. Toews has a BA in Film Studies from the University of Manitoba and a journalism degree from the University of King's College in Halifax. She's both produced radio documentaries and written for magazines and garnered the 1999 National Magazine Award Gold Medal for Humor. Toews also played the leading role in Carlos Regatta's film Silent Light, a film that took place in a Mennonite colony in northern Mexico. Silent Light was the winner of the jury prize at the 2007 Cannes Film Festival, was on many film critics' lists of the best films of the year, and is a film for which Toews was nominated for Best Actress at the Mexican Academy of Cinematographic Arts and Sciences Ariel Awards. Miriam Toews is, however, best known not for her past journalism, nor for her all-too-brief film career, but for her life as a storied novelist. Toews is the author of 6 novels and 1 memoir, including Summer of My Amazing Luck, A Complicated Kindness, and All My Puny Sorrows. She's the winner of many of Canada's most prestigious literary awards, including the Canadian Authors Association Award, the Rogers Writers Trust Fiction Prize, the McNally Robinson Book of the Year Award, and the Governor General's Award, whose past winners include such luminaries as Margaret Atwood, Michael Ondaatje, and Alice Munro. Miriam Toews is here today to talk about her latest book out from Bloomsbury entitled Women Talking. Described by Margaret Atwood as an amazing, sad, shocking, but touching novel based on a real-life event that could be right out of Handmaid's Tale, Women Talking has received starred reviews from Publishers Weekly, Kirkus, and Booklist. Lainey Zumas says of Women Talking, "I am in awe of this novel. In Toews' brilliant design, 8 women in a Mennonite hayloft managed to lay bare the rancid global root system of patriarchy. Their story is terrifying, joyful, gruesome, and magnetic. What a reckoning, what a gift." Madeleine Tien adds, "Women Talking wants another world to be possible, and in the rescripting of reality into fiction, attempts to imagine it where it has not yet grown of its own volition. The novel reminds us how difficult it is to know how to live, forgive others or ourselves, seek justice, or know freedom. No matter the depth of their solidarity, we can imagine that each individual will undoubtedly spend a lifetime coming to their own answers, seeking knowledge with their own hard-won words. But we can hope that the common questions asked by women talking, in the book Women Talking, their listening, their anger and love, their sometimes vastly differing conclusions, might offer a further way of seeing and finally choosing. Welcome to Between the Covers, Miriam Toews.
Thanks very much.
So when we open the book, we encounter not the beginning of the novel, but an author's note. An author's note that discusses a real-life situation that your novel is an imaginative reaction to. So before we talk about the novel itself, I'd love to ground listeners around the real-life event and also your orientation to it. So perhaps we can start with the encounter in non-fictional form that we encounter as readers, and that inspired you to write the book.
Mm-hmm. Between the years 2005 and 2009, the girls and women of the Manitoba colony in Bolivia, named after Manitoba, the province where I'm from, and where these particular Mennonites came from as well. This is an ultra conservative, closed Mennonite colony, and the girls and the women were waking up, realizing that they had been attacked in some way. They were sore, they were bleeding, they had rope marks, burn marks on their wrists, on their ankles. They didn't know what had happened. So these attacks continued to happen. Eventually, the women started talking a little bit amongst themselves about what was happening, realizing that they weren't alone, that this was happening to virtually every woman and girl in the colony. And so they started telling some of the leaders of the colony, the elders, who basically their response was, no, this is your imagination, or that, they used the term wild female imagination, or this is the work of the devil or of demons, Satan, as punishment for some sort of perceived sin that the women had committed, apparently. So they weren't believed, and not only were they not believed, but they were blamed for these attacks. So so they continued until finally. As the reports go, as the story goes, as the rumors go, one woman or two women stayed up late, night after night, and eventually caught one of the perpetrators, and then the whole thing unraveled. Others confessed. There were 7 or 8 men from the colony, Mennonite men, who were responsible for the rapes, and even then, the question was, well, what do we do with these men? Naturally, some of the people who had been raped, the male family members, especially of these women, wanted to punish these men somehow, seek revenge, and so basically, for the first time. The police were called in to basically arrest the men, take them to the city, put them on trial, and sentence them. And so now the rumors within the Mennonite community are that the men are in prison, but there are also rumors that the attacks are continuing. These colonies are self-policed, self-governed colonies, very isolated. The women don't speak the language of the country that they're in this case, Bolivia. They're illiterate. They don't leave the colony without being accompanied by a man, a husband, a father, etc. So there's nothing for them to do. They're virtual prisoners in these colonies, and then of course, victimized over and over in this culture of control and shame. So this is one way, and again, I go to lengths wherever I am and whenever I'm talking about this to explain that this is one way of being Mennonite. These old order closed colonies, ultra conservative colonies in remote places, but that's sort of one extreme end of the spectrum. I'm a Mennonite. I'm a secular Mennonite. I am literate, educated, live in a city, for example. So it's just important for people to know that not all Mennonites live in this, in this manner.
Well, the victims in the real life situation, they ranged from the age of 3 years old to 65. They were married, single residents of the colony and visitors, and it included at least 130 women and girls over the course of at least 5 years who would wake up bleeding, sometimes with semen or dirt or grass on them because they'd been bound and carried out to a field unconscious, facilitated by an animal anesthetic from the plant belladonna that the rapists would spray into the house so that they could take their victims and then return them. Tell us what prompted you about this story, this seemingly fantastical yet real story, why you wanted to engage with this in novel form.
Mm-hmm. Well, when I heard about the rapes, I was horrified like everybody else, but I wasn't surprised. I think I know other Mennonites who are familiar with these communities, feel the same way. The incidents of sexual violence, of domestic assault and incest and violence are, and patriarchal violence specifically within these colonies is they're so sky high in terms of the numbers, so this kind of horrific sort of series of crimes was not surprising given the culture, given and particularly the roles of men and women within the community, the entitlement of the men, the dehumanization of the women, the inherent misogyny of the fundamentalism that they preach, the interpretation of the Bible. So again, it wasn't surprising, but at the same time, I wanted to. I'm a novelist, so my thoughts, generally go towards wanting to craft some sort of narrative around this stuff that and I knew that I had so many questions that were really basically extensions of the questions that I've had all of my life growing up in a very conservative Mennonite community. And here, after hearing about these crimes, the questions were raised again in my mind, and I wanted to address them in my fiction. But it took me, years really to figure out how to do it, how to enter the story in a sense, how to structure the story. I wrote a different book in the meantime, I was taking notes. I was reading, what I could and talking to people who were and are directly connected to some of the members of the colony.
Well, before we go to the place of how you took this nonfiction event and brought it into fiction, I do love the way the book begins, particularly given the fact that the women were being accused, or the cause of the rapes was originally attributed to the wild female imagination. And then we open with this line: women talking is both a reaction through fiction to these real events and an act of female imagination, a very barbed and appropriately barbed beginning. But before we look at the ways you bring it into fiction, I was wondering if we could just parse a little more your orientation as a Mennonite, because you did mention that you're a secular Mennonite, and that there's a wide variety of ways a person could be a Mennonite in the world, and varying degrees of relationship to modernity, where the old colonists don't have electricity or phones, don't use cars. That's not going to be true across the board. You're going to see a wide array, but even within the idea of a fundamentalist Mennonite community, the one that you grew up in, a fundamentalist Mennonite community in Manitoba, and the old colony Mennonites both come from Russia originally, but they're not the same either, and they don't have the same relationship to each other. So could you parse that a little bit for us, the difference between fundamentalist Mennonite community like the one you knew and an old colony Mennonite community? What are the overlaps and what are the differences that come to mind?
It's funny. I was talking with some of my friends from who also, of course, happen to be my relatives because we're all related in the communities that we come from. And we were saying how even though these closed colonies, one might think that the rules and that the conditions are so extreme that they're somehow foreign to us, but really they're not. I mean, in the community that I grew up in, a fundamentalist community for sure, although we dressed differently. We weren't dressing in the sort of the uniform style, as it were, probably the wrong word to use, as the Mennonites in the colonies, who are very recognizable with their long dresses, the women with the long dresses and hair covering, and the men in their overalls and hats. And though we did drive cars, in my Mennonite community and had electricity, et cetera, really the rules were the same. The sins the possibility, the vast array of sins that we could be committing at any given time, often to our own bewilderment. That kind of group think, the emphasis on punishment, on guilt, on shame, on silence. And again, that the very strict roles for men and for women. I mean, that was all the same. And again, the fundamentalist interpretation of the scripture, which is used by the elders, by the religious leaders in the community, in mine and in the closed colonies, to really to hold, to maintain order, and particularly power for those for the elite, for the leaders, who are all male, of course. So, so in those kind of most fundamental ways, they're similar.
Do you see the old colonists leaving Canada for Mexico and then leaving Mexico for Belize and Bolivia as a way for them to maintain their own self-policing insular societies? I mean, are these emigrations prompted by something impinging upon them within the countries that they're living in, that they seek out other places where they can live in a way that's sort of hermetic and self-policed?
Absolutely, which again, only perpetuates the violence. But because of that, the self-policing and the hermetic, like you say, insulation, insularity of the colonies, and not that I am on board or believe in policing in the first place, or incarceration, or the justice system as it stands, but certainly that idea of governance is something that only further serves to harm and the most vulnerable in the colonies, who are usually women. But yeah, those Mennonites, and so the Russian Mennonites. This is my community of Mennonites, moving from when there is pressure from the government to assimilate, to put the kids in regular schools, for instance, to learn the language, to join the military. Then the tradition is that then Mennonites, most of them, if not all, some stay behind and do assimilate or not, but will move to another country. And I hold some of these countries, they're complicit as well by saying, okay, these Mennonites, we want to populate this particular part of our country. We can get these Mennonites in. We'll sell this land to them for cheap. They're looking for a place to practice their religion, someplace that's remote and isolated. They'll contribute to the economy. They'll stay out of trouble, and we won't have to worry about them. And so, it's that kind of deal that is so often made. So from Russia to Canada, and then from my communities specifically Steinbach, which is my hometown, but other communities in the area. When that government pressure, was put on them to assimilate, they many of them moved south to Mexico, to northern Mexico, to Chihuahua, to other places, and then again it happens there, and then the Mennonites move further afield to, for instance, Belize, Paraguay, Bolivia. Now, I was recently told by somebody connected to the colonists that in Bolivia that they're looking for land in Angola. So there's a constant migration, a constant movement of Mennonites searching for that part of the world, where they're free to. They would say free to practice their religion, but I think that, of course, with that comes also, and they know this, the freedom to not only to practice their religion, but also to engage in harmful behavior, and violent behavior.
In case you just tuned in, we're talking today to Miriam Toews about her latest book, Women Talking. You did mention, Miriam, that it took you a while to figure out how to tell the story. And I think one of the most remarkable things about this book is that you didn't choose to tell it as a lurid enactment of the violence or even a book about the trial of the men. That Women Talking is literally a book of women talking. It's taking place after the rapists have been caught and before their trial, and the men of the colony have gone to town to try to post bail so that the accused rapists can come home to the community while awaiting trial, and perversely so that the women can forgive them so that the women's prospect of going to heaven isn't imperiled. And the novel is essentially the portrayal of 8 women meeting in a hayloft, deciding what they're going to do before the men return in less than 2 days. And this feels like really an ingenious setup. And I wanted to ask you about the process of arriving at this as the structure and focus of the novel, but I also sort of want to partially hand off this question to a past guest, Catherine Lacey, to have her re-ask it in her own words, because she's the reason I first heard about the book when she was on Between the Covers, and she tweeted about it, and we talked about her tweet, and her tweet was, "Women Talking is the best contemporary novel I have ever read. I am usually not one for making digital noise about galleys, but Miriam Toews just elegantly demolished this whole century, and I cannot shut up about it." So when I knew you were coming on the show, I reached out to see if she had any questions, and I just want to read what she responded. "I'm still wondering what can even be asked of Toews. I really feel like that book is one of those remarkably complete works of art that resists all questions that aren't wide-eyed statements of wonder. It's such a complete, wholehearted book. Here's a question, perhaps. Were there any roads during the writing of Women Talking that turned out to be dead ends? Or put another way, how is the resulting book different from the book you may have anticipated? What was thrown out?" And then she says to me as an aside, "A part of me suspects, whether erroneously or not, that any masterpiece likely arrives on a direct route from mind to page. But perhaps that's too romantic a notion of the very human, messy route a book usually seems to take." So, long story short, I was hoping you could talk about that thinking process, because you arrive at this wonderful structure and conceit for how to enter the story. But how was the beforehand of that and figuring that out?
I so admire Catherine Lacey that I'm just, really, I really appreciate those comments. Thank you for that. And she knows, she's right. I mean, there is, in a sense, on the one hand, it's, I think, with writing, with certain books, maybe all books, when you've finished with the kind of preliminary circling around and trying to figure out how to enter the book, how to enter the story, then there often does seem to be a kind of, sort of in a way, seamless sort of push towards the end where it seems as though, okay, yeah, this is the obvious choice. This is how it needs to be written. This is what I need to be asking. But before that happens, if that happens, it's all a little bit mysterious to me as well. But with this book, I did very, very briefly think about the idea of revenge, revenge is, revenge stories are stories, books or films that I often do enjoy. I can appreciate them, but I realized very quickly that that's not really my, MO, as they say. That's not what I'm looking for, and that's not what I'm thinking about. It would be a kind of very temporary, superficial response that might be satisfying in the moment. But of course, revenge only leads to more violence. And so I knew that wasn't the story that I wanted to tell, nor would it be a believable. It wouldn't be a realistic kind of response from the women either. At no point in the book, really. I mean, there are some characters, one in particular who is a little bit more vengeful than the others, and rather homicidal, and wanting to do these men harm for sure. But essentially, that's not what they're thinking about. What they're talking about. The women are trying to figure out what they will do in order to protect their children, to think, to gain agency, to over their own lives, to be able to control their own lives, and also very importantly to keep their faith. So the idea of revenge just didn't seem like a natural or believable or honest thing that they would. But so I did, very, very early on, before I even started writing it, entertain that for maybe, I remember walking around the block a few times and thinking, what if, and quickly realizing that that's not where I wanted to go.
There's this great line in the book that one of the women says, and it's, "There is no plot, only women talking." And when the women say plot, they're using it to say there's no plotting behind the women's back. But what is so great about the book is the book really is a book of quote unquote talking, but it's mesmerizing. The women are debating strategy, ethics, biblical interpretation, questions of identity and justice. And the book manages to be both very funny at times and fraught with tension as the clock is ticking, with the men about to return. And it feels like a book of women talking instead of plot underscores the act of women talking on their own terms and defining their own terms and debating the terms. It does feel like a revolutionary act. And I wanted to hear about this, because I think the women would reject the term revolutionary who are speaking it. But I wanted to hear about a little bit about the tension, or maybe a false tension, between talking and plot. Mm-hmm.
You're right. The women would absolutely deny that they were revolutionaries. That just wouldn't be a part of their thinking or their vocabulary. Or certainly they know that they're fighting against something, but at the same time they grapple with that too, because they're pacifists, they're non-resistors, they're the faith, the essential tenets of the faith are important to them, and so yeah, they don't think of themselves as revolutionaries, or that they are planning or plotting a revolution or some sort of insurgence, resistance, but. For I guess in terms of the idea of women, just the idea of women talking, I think is something that I have noticed in my community, and it's something that I have been dealing with all of my life, from the Mennonite patriarchy, is that fear, the fact that it is such a threatening thing for particularly these types of individuals, authoritarian religious, controlling and rule bound, and the leaders of the Mennonite colonies in my own community as well. It's it's funny in a way that something like that can be so threatening. But I think that part of the entire machinery of these communities is the sort of the structure is it's the built-in need to keep the women silent, to prevent them from talking to each other, to prevent them from taking control over their own lives, and particularly rebelling against the men. And that's exactly what the Mennonites in the Mennonite community. Not in my book, but in the real Mennonite community, I do have a lot of support from Mennonites, but the Mennonites who are very angry with me and who wish that I would stop writing and stop speaking, that is the thing that they're most angry about, is especially with this book, is that because I've written other books that are critical again of fundamentalism, of that culture of control, and that hasn't seemed to have those books haven't seemed to have angered them in a way that this one does, and I know that it's because they've told me it's this idea of the women getting together, organizing in a sense, and also even entertaining the thought of, as one of the characters says, creating their own religion, which is just heresy sacrilegious. I mean, for the religious leaders of these communities to hear something like that, first of all, that it would be women. Secondly, that they would be planning, this type of reinterpretation of the scripture. So of course, what these women are doing is revolutionary.
Well, in many of your interviews, you've described the situation for the women in the colonies as being imprisoned, and even though they're not literally physically imprisoned, there are a lot of ways they're structurally and culturally imprisoned. And one of those ways is around language. And you mentioned, for instance, in Bolivia, they don't speak Spanish. The men speak Spanish. But they also don't have, they speak an unwritten medieval language that Mennonites speak, Low German, and they're functionally illiterate. But they never have access to actually seeing, because of that, a Bible, to be able to form their own opinions about how the men are interpreting the Bible and thus how the men are operating the colony. And they've never seen maps, so they can't place themselves in place around that. And I guess I was curious about your thoughts, or further thoughts you have around, since we're talking about women talking, the way language is potentially used as a way to exclude women from, they're able to talk, but they're not able to communicate in a certain way.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, and without language, without that vocabulary, without that form of expression, essentially, how can they plan? How can they, sort of filter their experience, their thoughts into something, some sort of tangible course of action? And I mean, it's true. They don't speak the language of the country that they're in, which in this case would be, in Bolivia, would be Spanish. The language that they do speak is unwritten, and they're illiterate, functionally illiterate, as you say. So I mean, they are prisoners, and not only are they physical prisoners within these closed colonies, unable to leave. I mean, there's no, bus or cab or airport or train station anywhere nearby, of course, and they don't leave without being accompanied by a man. They're also spiritual, mental. I mean, their minds, their bodies, their souls are policed in a sense by the men of the colony and the leaders of the colony, and so even the idea of using language, of the possibility of using language to kind of to craft a manifesto, if you want to call it that. The women wouldn't use that word, and they joke about it. They downplay that. They joke about the word and about the meaning of the word, but they're dead serious, and that is in fact what they're doing. And language is a necessary tool, and they're kept from it, and of course that only serves to divide, to silence, and again to put all of the power in the hands of the men in the community, and they talk about words, and they talk about the futility of words, and the specific. What does this word mean exactly? We need to know exactly what we're talking about. They need to know how to define what it is that they're doing in order to make it make sense. And so language, the debate around language, around the precise definition of words, is something that they engage in as well, because it's a tool. I mean, it is a tool. It's a revolutionary tool.
When I think of the colony situation for the women, I think of how it isn't entirely or necessarily Mennonite specific, but at least for me, when I was reading it, I was thinking of other self-policed, self-isolating fundamentalist situations, like the recent revelation of Catholic nuns being turned into literal sex slaves for priests, or to the some Mormon communities that still practice polygamy and have extremely young girls as wives. And I suspect there's probably analogous situations in fundamentalist, closed Jewish and Muslim communities. And it also feels like this seemingly extreme scenario points out things that are there in the everyday secular world too, or at least I wanted to hear your thoughts on that. For one, it made me think of Kathy Acker's acts of appropriation, or what she would call literary piracy. The way women, both in the world at large and also in language, have to operate within the rules and with the tools that they didn't create, and with a canon that largely doesn't include them. And with Acker's response being that women should become literary criminals who break the literary laws, and in a way they become original through theft. And I also was thinking of a recent reconsideration of the controversial feminist icon, Andrea Dworkin, that I was reading about in the New York Times. And they quoted something from her that felt like it spoke both to the structural disempowerment of secular women and also to the old colony women somehow at the same time. Dworkin said, "Our enemies, rapists, and their defenders not only go unpunished, they remain influential arbiters of morality. They have high and esteemed places in the society. They are priests, lawyers, judges, lawmakers, politicians, doctors, artists, corporation executives, psychiatrists, and teachers." I guess what I'm leading to is a curiosity about your thoughts about how, if at all, this story of this grotesque story of the old colony Mennonite community, how you see that applying or not to lessons for a person living a secular life, either secular Mennonite in Toronto or a secular non-Mennonite person.
One of the goals or the hope, I guess, with the book is that although it is a specific setting, specific people that are so exotic in a way that it transcends that, and I mean these types of crime. I mean, you look at somebody like Bill Cosby, you look at the number of women who have been raped and assaulted, on university campuses, which for instance are these bastions of secular thinking, of enlightenment, and so I mean it is across the board. And I think it's easy for a woman like myself anyway, when I'm wandering around downtown Toronto at night, I feel relatively safe. I feel somewhat empowered. I know that if something, that I have recourse, unlike the women in these Orthodox communities. But at the same time, one can so quickly be reminded that no, I am vulnerable, and we are, and and that type of entitlement, like you say, I mean, there are different ways that male entitlement can be acted on, or can be can transpire, and it's not only from a fundamentalist interpretation of the Bible that says women submit to your husbands, or children submit to your daughters, submit to your fathers, but also from positions of power, like you say, and so, I mean, it's there's more conversation around it now, and thankfully, but just because women haven't necessarily been talking about it as much as they are now doesn't mean that they weren't realizing it and experiencing it. I mean, I guess one of the questions that a lot of readers ask me too is, am I hopeful that that there's some change, something will happen, but and I'm sorry, I'm not articulating this very well, but and I am hopeful, but it seems like it's a long ways away.
Well, when we think about talking as potentially a revolutionary act, or women talking as a revolutionary act, and think of that in relationship to silence. In the real life Bolivian case, a code of silence descended upon the community after the trials. There was no apparent colony-wide self-reckoning, and the women were never offered therapy, even though Mennonite groups from abroad had offered to send Mennonite therapists who spoke Low German to work with the women. The men never relayed this offer to the wives and daughters and sisters, so they never had the opportunity to consider the offer. I know there's tension potentially between old colonists and other types of Mennonites, so there would be that politics too, but they were never participants in deciding whether to have the ability to choose about having therapy. But perhaps the ultimate way a person's voice could be erased is that the women were not allowed to testify at their own trial on their own behalf, that men spoke for them on their behalf. And I wanted to take that phenomenon in real life Bolivia and look at the question of silence and the Mennonite notion that certain things should not be exposed in relationship to the essay that you wrote in Granta called Peace Shall Destroy Many. And you start that piece with the Mennonite author Rudy Wiebe, who in the 60s wrote a book called Peace Shall Destroy Many that looks at the Mennonite tenets of pacifism and non-conflict and suggests that these tenets might themselves be sources of violence and conflict, that he was wondering whether the Mennonite anti-war stance was self-serving when Mennonite farmers were still selling produce to the Canadian Army at a profit, and other things. And in your essay, you link the response in the Mennonite community that certain things shouldn't be exposed to the time-honored Mennonite practice of avoiding conflict and refusing engagement, that the shouldn't be exposed was sort of the dark underbelly of Mennonite pacifism. And in one line you say, war is hell, it's true. Shouldn't be exposed is another hell. Shouldn't be exposed stifles and silences and violates. Shouldn't be exposed refuses and ignores and shames. Shouldn't be exposed shields, bullies, and tyrants. I have seen it in my own life. I would just love to hear your thoughts, I guess, about what you did see in your own life around shouldn't be exposed in the Mennonite community you grew up in.
Oh, well, I mean, it's hard to know where to begin. I mean, really, honestly, genuinely, just about everything. If you start off with everything that happens being God's will, for instance, then even the expression of anger in the Mennonite community, at least how I grew up, was considered to be a great sin, really a moral failure, and any hard, intense emotion, but particularly anger, particularly that act of resistance, of challenging. Conflict was avoided if at all possible, but of course, there was conflict happening all of the time. It just wasn't acknowledged or spoken of or dealt with directly. The levels of the passive aggression, aggressiveness happiness that is sort of a typical Mennonite way of expressing displeasure. Oh, hey, it's so good to see you here in church. This week. Have you been? You must have been sick recently, because I haven't seen you for. I'm so sorry that you were sick. And if, I mean, that's just a superficial, silly example, but then on, more seriously, when you feel that any expression of discontent, let alone rage, is considered a sin, which you will be punished for, not only, within the community, be it by excommunication or shunning or some type of discipline, but also by God, and I mean, that's a real thing. That's, the expression of, any kind of, even physical expression, movement, dancing, any sort of expression of pure joy is considered suspect. I remember, dancing for a little bit when I was a kid in the hallway of my school. Just I was happy about something. I don't know what it was. I was a little kid, and my teachers, several of them, rushing and saying, "Stop it, and telling me that I needed to have my wings clipped. Because of that type of expression. So when you are experiencing, and this, in my mother, for instance, in my community, was a social worker and then a therapist, dealing mostly with Mennonites, of course, and she was able to speak the language of Plautich, so she could offer therapy, and they could communicate. But the domestic violence and so many the only option, really. I mean, she was the only therapist / social worker in her in the town, and the option of going to, you could possibly go to the minister of the church and say, this is what's happening to me at home, and the minister would, say, you need to forgive your husband, and basically, suck it up. I mean, there's just. And for myself too, I mean, for the expression, for me, listening to, again, this seems so superficial and kind of irrelevant, but, music, rock music, whatever it is, certain books. And my family was a bit of an anomaly within the community. We were encouraged to read and to go to university and to speak our minds. But this was, highly unusual. So, I mean, at whatever age it is, if you're, a little kid dancing in the school corridor, or you're a teenager listening to, Led Zeppelin, or you're a battered wife attempting to get some kind of counseling, all of this stuff is suppressed, and again, that rigid sense of control that the leaders, that the elders need to maintain in order to prevent, the terrifying things in their mind, the things in their minds that are terrifying, which include, people leaving, people, sort of peeling away the facade of these, self-governed pacifist, communities, that are supposedly, with the emphasis on forgiveness and harmony and peace, the reality is vastly different from that, and to express any of that, to see it, first of all, to observe it, to identify that, is one thing, but then to talk about it is something that is impossible without consequence.
In case you just tuned in, we're talking today to Miriam Toews about her latest book, Women Talking. Well, you mentioned that Women Talking is the book that has prompted the most anger from certain sectors of the Mennonite community. And Rudy Wiebe, who you were writing about in his book, he was fired from his job at the newspaper. He was denounced as a liar and a traitor and called an atheist, though views have really softened toward him over the years. I was just curious about what that felt like to be on a joint book tour with him, as sort of somebody who had experienced some of this blowback prior to you in a different generation.
Yeah, I mean, Rudy Wiebe is a friend and a great writer, and he's been very, he in some ways a type of maybe literary father figure in a way. He's gone back to the church. I'm not sure that he ever. I don't think. I mean, these charges of atheism and of having lost his faith or of somehow I don't think they were ever true according to him. I mean, he was just speaking out about what he was seeing in the community, with the hope that there could be discussion around it. Maybe that's naive. He would probably say that it was naive of him at that point, and but to think that there could be discussion. But he and I remain hopeful. But I know that he is he is a part of the Mennonite Church now, and belongs to a very liberal church, like my mother, for instance, who belongs to a very liberal, progressive, very nurturing church. But the tour, so the tour, there were angry people. I mean, people were angry with what I was writing. We were in very conservative small towns in Germany touring around together. It was quite fun, actually, except for the angry people. and he he absolutely defended me and tried to explain that that what I was attempting to do was something that he also had attempted to do, which was to generate some sort of discussion. That we can, as Mennonites, we can be self-critical. We can say, look, we have problems in our midst. Maybe some of these traditions, maybe some of these, our lifestyles in some way conducive to this kind of, harm, and maybe we could, look at that and change, etc. But again, there were people then when he started writing, and people now who just don't want to hear that, who put so much energy towards silencing this stuff, towards making it go away, towards that denial, because they're very, as opposed to protecting the women, for instance, in their communities, or of changing, or of addressing the problems of violence. It was really comforting. I felt so supported by his by his friendship, by his defending me. That felt good, because he's kind of this Mennonite superstar. Not only Mennonite, but just in the literary world. And Rudy Wiebe, and I talked about this, that. There's a certain. I mean, there are a number of Mennonites, and I would say that they are exclusively male, though not completely. Maybe not exclusively male, but mostly, who are very, very concerned about the Mennonite brand, as it were, about public perception of Mennonites. Mennonites have a reputation. Everywhere I go, people not super familiar with Mennonites will say, "Oh, but I always thought Mennonites were these peace-loving, hard-working, sweet, going into places and delivering aid and help to the unfortunate." And and there's an element of truth to that, obviously, and obviously there are decent Mennonites, but the men predominantly who are upset with the stuff that Rudy Wiebe used to write and the stuff that I write, are those who are very concerned with that public perception. And I would imagine that, for the most part, they have a kind of vested interest in it. Either they're, and there's money involved as well. I mean, they want people to join the Mennonite Church, to tithe to the Mennonite Church, to support the Mennonite Church, and to support that, power.
Well, let's talk more about the heart of the book, the conversation that the women have. So we are with 8 women who show up in the hayloft to discuss and debate what to do before the men return. And it's 2 families, 3 generations of women, 4 women in each family. Can you talk to us a little bit about the debate that they have, the options that they consider, and then the considerations with how you wanted to portray the women in the room, and which women you wanted to have in the room in the first place?
So the women, they're two families. Teenagers, their mothers, and their mothers. So, middle-aged women and grandmothers, and teenagers, 8 women. And each of the women is modeled after, a Mennonite woman that I know. Either I'm related to my sister, my mother, my grandmother, or friends. And it was important to me that the women are, I think it's easy to think of these Mennonites as these, weirdos living in the middle of nowhere doing strange things and, kind of not entirely human. And it was important to me to show that they are human beings, that they are capable of debate, of thinking, of consensus, of working through ideas, of considering different options, and obviously, so they are critical of each other at times. They laugh, they joke, they come together, and when they're singing, and sort of worshiping with scripture and. They contradict themselves. They're ordinary women, performing something that's probably revolutionary. So I guess that's, when I was thinking about who they were, I just thought of the women that I know.
Well, one of the things that makes the debate really fascinating is that it's constrained by their desire to remain pacifists, and also to come up with a solution that arises from their faith. There are women in the hayloft who flirt with the boundaries of faith and wonder whether they should stay within those boundaries. But for the most part, they're trying to puzzle out some philosophical questions that are pretty complex within a framework that they want to honor at the same time. And I was wanting to hear more about that, about this. Because it would be easy to put people in a situation where they don't have those constraints, and they could come up with all sorts of different potential things. But it becomes, I think, more fascinating and also likely more real that they're having to puzzle it out in a way that also reflects where they come from.
Absolutely. They're making their decision within the context of their faith. Their faith. They have these. They have 3 options: whether they'll stay and fight, whether they'll leave, whether they'll do nothing. But they also have 3 things that they want to achieve, which are to think, to make decisions for themselves, to decide for themselves how they'll live, to protect their children, and to keep their faith. And so everything that they talk about, is and that's the basis of their experience in life, of the information that they've gleaned, but also been handed down by the religious leaders, but also that they've come to think about, often that they inhabit. They inhabit that faith, and for them, and that's for them to even imagine making decisions or living in some way, creating a lifestyle outside of that faith is impossible. So even if they do entertain the idea of, and are hashing it out and puzzling it out, like you say, there's never any question that if they leave or if they stay, everything that they do will be bound up with their faith, with the tenets of the Mennonite faith in particular, with the gospel, with the teachings of Jesus, and that's that I feel in my mind because of where I come from and my own way of kind of living or defining my life or seeing or the context that I have when I'm making decisions of my own, that will always be, their focus. And the loft, in a sense, I mean, they're in a loft, which for me was symbolic of that kind of that kind of liminal space, really, between earth and sky. Of course, they have all of their earthly concerns and problems. They need to figure out, how they're going to live, survive, eat, etc. But they're also grappling with huge theological questions, in a sense, philosophical questions and ideas, and spiritual ones as well. So it's.
I love the way that, for instance, one of the reasons that they might decide to leave, if they were to decide to leave, is not because they'd be leaving the Mennonite faith, but in order to preserve their faith, in a sense that if they couldn't imagine staying and not being filled with hatred or the urge to violence, then the only way to protect their souls was to be away from the men. I mean, that wasn't necessarily a decision that comes to, but it was something that was brought up, which is very fascinating and maybe counterintuitive, that leaving could be staying within the faith.
Absolutely. And also, with the idea of forgiveness too, that they know and they want to, they know that the onus is on them to forgive, and they want to forgive. They don't know how necessarily they will be able to forgive genuinely. But they also talk about the idea of, leaving being, if they were to leave, that this would give them that distance that they need to get to that place of forgiveness.
Well, I think it's also worthwhile pointing out that 8 women show up at the hayloft, but there's a lot of women who don't go to this debate. And it makes me think about the role of silence and the framework of silencing, and makes me wonder about the women who aren't in the book, who, and for what reasons are they not there? I mean, some of them I'm assuming might want to be there, and others might not want to be there. But I wanted to take that framing around silencing that's cultural and linguistic, and read a little quote from an essay by Anne Carson called "Variations on the Right to Remain Silent," and that essay is about translation. But in it, she engages with the trial of Joan of Arc. And I'm going to read a description of that trial, just sort of as a setup for a question I have about the way you frame the book. And so this is Anne Carson about Joan of Arc. Her trial lasted from January to May of 1431 and entailed a magistrate's inquest, 6 public interrogations, 9 private interrogations, an abjuration, a relapse trial, and condemnation. Her death by fire took place on May 30th, 1431. Thousands of words went back and forth between Joan and her judges during the months of her inquisition. Many of them are available to us in some form. But Joan herself was illiterate. She spoke Middle French at her trial, whose minutes were then transcribed by a notary and later translated into Latin by one of her judges. This process involved not only the transposition of Joan's direct responses into indirect speech and of her French idioms into the Latin of juridical protocol, but also deliberate falsification of some of her answers in such a way as to justify her condemnation. This was revealed at the retrial 25 years after her death. And I think of this trial in relationship to women talking because of how buried the women's hayloft conversation is within the structure of patriarchy. So the first person who speaks in Women Talking is a man. He's both the narrator of the book and the minute taker of their conversation. And he's translating the Low German spoken by the women into English, but he has to do this quickly as it is spoken. So, of course, this might not be accurate, no matter how well-intentioned he is. We also learn, before we know much about him, that he has a past criminal history and is possibly mentally ill. And it made me think that, like Joan of Arc, no matter how benevolent our narrator, August Epps, is, and I think ultimately we find out that he is, the very fact that he has to tell us the story because these women can't read or write, because they don't have access to maps to know where they are, because they can't read the Bible to assess its interpretation, it's almost like the very presence of August as the frame shows us just how much translation has to happen before their voices will be heard in any form. I guess I wanted to hear your thoughts about that, because I feel like you've spoken about important reasons why you wanted August to tell the story that are very different than that. But I also feel like, not knowing those intentions on your behalf, it also feels like August just shows how deeply buried women's voices are to begin with, that even when we have a book about women talking, we have to contend with the minute taker.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm just still struck by the passage that you read. That's just so fascinating. I would love to read more of that, and also that translation. Speaking of translations, of her trial, of Joan of Arc's trial. But yeah, I mean, August. It's true. What do we really know, or can we really know when there are so many layers? Like you say, the translation first from the English or from the Low German, from the Plautdeutsch into English, and then done in a hurried manner, and with obvious choices being made, by August, or by the narrator, by the minute taker, to just choices that he's making based on his own experience, and his own kind of emotional and or intellectual interpretation of what they're saying. So, and then of course at the end, the minutes are irrelevant. The whole, one of the reasons why he's there, of course, is because Ona, one of the characters, has, in an act of compassion, said, "Hey, August, we know you're suffering, you're despairing, you're suicidal. Come stay with us. You'll be safe. We'll give you this task." But it's not something that they need. It's not something that they need to make their decision. They're doing something more important than simply documenting what it is that they're doing. In the hope, of course, and the implication is that they'll go on to write their own stories, or maybe their grandchildren or great grandchildren will, and there won't be any translation necessary. But when I was thinking about, further to your question, about when I decided that the book would be a response to the rapes, that the content of the book would be these minutes of these meetings, and I also had to grapple with this kind of problem that I have, or I don't know what it is, a kind of pathology or strange sort of tendency, which is to fight with every book that I write, to fight for, to believe in its relevance, to fight a sense of kind of creeping futility, that I experience. So why am I doing this? Why am I writing this? There's no reason to write this book, and whether that means that I have other issues that need addressing, or if it's just the way that I write, the way that I get going. But so this book and other books of mine as well, there's often a kind of reason that, for instance, in an older book of mine, In a Complicated Kindness, the 16-year-old protagonist is the whole book is an assignment that she's writing. So she had that assignment. So that meant that I then had an assignment. She's my protagonist. So then it made sense. Okay, I have this assignment to write this book. And I know that sounds kind of flaky and sort of esoteric and intangible, and it is, but it makes sense in my mind. It gives me then a reason. And so if I could I could become August in a sense, having a task, a fictional task within the act of writing the fiction. I know this is sort of a meta, kind of thing, but for that reason, it made sense to me on that level as well. But it's so true, with that trial, with the Anne Carson's piece about Joan of Arc's trial, and in a sense, I mean, this story too. I mean, we're left possibly at the end, and like with so many trials of women, with so many acts of condemnation, where what they say, what we say, is altered, changed, to justify the punishment. the condemnation, like you say. How will we ever, really know what was said?
Can you talk about that in relationship to the gesture at the end of Women Talking, which isn't really a spoiler of any sort, but the turning away from the minutes. But there's also turning away from the word and books and other books of yours. And there's this intertextuality and this questioning of language. In this book, which is one of the delightful things of this book, we get August's sort of translation asides. We get these parentheticals where he's debating how to translate something as we read. But say, like in Irma Voth, you get the intentional mistranslations of the movie that changes the narrative. Can you talk a little bit about what you're doing there? Mm-hmm. It feels like you return to over and over again these endings, which I think depart from language, mm-hmm. and also this throughout the books, sort of a foregrounding of maybe, I don't know if the artificiality of language or the limitations of language.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And in Irma Voth, too, she's given, again, a kind of a task in a way by the director of the film for whom she's working. Here's a notebook, Irma, record your thoughts. This will be interesting for you to do. And so she very earnestly attempts to do that, always crossing things out, rewriting. No, that's not. And again, like you say, misinterpreting intentionally what the script, to make it more honest. Yeah, I guess, what am I doing? I mean, that's, I think, lately I've been thinking, I've been thinking more about that and what that says about me, but also what it says about my relationship with my work, with my writing, and with language. And with this notion of is it possible to ever really write anything that's, that's just, that really gets at the thing and the limitations and the failure of language and of words. And All My Puny Sorrows, which is a book that I wrote before this book, there's a pile of books. One of the characters who is dead set. It's a bad joke on ending her life, on killing herself. There's towards the end of that book, she goes to her home. She leaves the hospital and goes to her home, and her partner has gone to the library as per her instructions and checked out a bunch of books that she says she wants to read, and they're in a stack, and there they are, and she sees them, and they're there, but she doesn't go to them. But in fact, she goes to end her life, and so and that's as explicit as can be. I mean, the failure of language, the failure of books, the failure of narrative, of words, of translation, of expression. To ever sort of understand, to ever come to a kind of real clear, understanding, definition of the human heart, soul. So, and that's something that I feel that I'm constantly struggling with. That essentially everything I write, it feels like that type of similar failure in its attempt to, or in my attempt to write something that's true. So, and maybe other writers feel the same way, probably.
Well, one of the things that August does in the book is he recounts a tale of stealing pears from a pear tree, which parallels the Confession of St. Augustine. And I was wanting to hear why you want to twin August mm-hmm. with Augustine in the book. Again,
because of the religious symbolism and parallel. This is a religious community. August is also a religious in a sense guy. He also struggles with his faith in the way that Augustine did. He struggles with his own human need. Whether it's sexual or intellectual, or even just simply physical, just his human needs. And so, he struggles with that, kind of against, versus a sort of spirituality and a spiritual context to life, but or way of living, and I think Augustine did as well. And Augustine also had a tendency to write and write and write and write and write, as we know, almost I can't remember the name of that disease, but where he can't stop himself from writing. And I just like the parallel with August, who of course is there to write,
Right.
to write quickly,
Yeah.
and honestly.
I love that.
Yeah.
Well, he does feel like, I think August feels like the perfect narrator beyond the fact that he's personable and lovable. Because he's an insider-outsider, he growing up in the colony, leaving to the secular world and then returning again. So he has a certain authority, but he also is sort of a window for those of us who didn't have a Mennonite childhood. But there's another way in which August is an insider-outsider, and that's the way he has low status among the men. He's seen as effeminate, as a half-man, and thus it isn't really strange that he's been left behind by the men as they go to town to post bail for the accused rapists. And perhaps that's even the reason why the women aren't suspicious about having him as a minute taker among the women attending their strategy meeting. So I guess I wanted to hear a little bit about masculinity in relationship to August and the insider-outsider aspect of him that is based on him being seen as a diminished man or a feminized man.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and not only that, but also a damaged man, because he has been in the world, for all of those years, and because of his dubious lineage, so I mean, he's sort of discounted in so many ways, and certainly, the fact that he's educated, that he believes in reading and writing and reasoning. And much like, again, he's a character that I, used my own father to, who served as inspiration for the character of August. My father was a teacher and also maligned and mocked, by the so-called real men of the community. My father liked to do things like ride his bike around and walk and read books and write books. In fact, and of course, he was an elementary school teacher, which was considered, a sort of preposterous thing to be, and August, is a similar character, and struggling, of course, with a mental illness, which isn't named as anything other than narfa in the book, or nervousness, but a nervous disposition, but. That August can bring to the narrative because of, as you said, his outside experience. He's in both. He's in the closed colony, and he has this outside experience to bring to the narrative. And for me, it was useful just simply in terms of the pacing and the rhythm and of the book, lending a kind of breath in a sense, so that with the intensity of the women's conversation as they hash this out, and it's so urgent, and the stakes are so high, and these sort of deep philosophical questions that they're grappling with, to then have August just come in periodically with one of his anecdotes, or one of his observations, or one of his memories, or one of his own questions. I felt what was a kind of nice, if there is any sort of musicality to the narrative, or any narrative, then it offers a type of breath away, and it gives the women a chance to observe August in a sense, and we see how they feel about him, and certainly one of the women basically feels about him as she's sort of absorbed that kind of that feeling of whatever dislike, distrust of, or of August as not being quite man enough. He doesn't know how to farm. This is very suspicious within this community, and for those reasons, some of the other women do feel close to him. They feel that he is somebody almost like them in a sense, somebody that they can trust, and he certainly does. As the narrative goes on, and as he's he's there in the loft, and it's that inversion of roles again, as the women are the philosophers and planning and, having their important discussion. He's there to listen and to learn and to bear witness. And he comes to his own kind of not conclusions certainly, but he learns to his love for the women is strengthened, and his respect, and he asks himself, how will, if the women leave, how will I live without these women? What will he do? So he's left with questions of his own.
Well, when I think about the limited definition of masculinity in relationship to the actual Bolivian old colony case, from what I was reading, there were men and boys who were also raped, but these victims were not included in the legal case. And I'm guessing that probably arises from the shame or silence around that the men and boys wouldn't want to be potentially, or I don't know, but it was curious. It came out to me as very striking that not one of them is part of the case.
Absolutely, yeah. That I was told that too by several people with links, with contact with colony members, that there were boys involved, and and that's important to know that although in that kind of patriarchal violence and that kind of authoritarianism, etc., isn't something that's confined to the women, that men and boys suffer under these patriarchies as well. And there would be a huge, deep shame in that. I mean, basically, I don't think that the men or the boys would ever talk about it, necessarily, and certainly that's not the narrative that comes from the colony around this story. But it is true that boys are also raped, and
it's one of the, I think, conundrums in their debate. Also, in the sense that if they decide to leave, what do they do with their sons, and at what age are one of their sons a man, and would they bring the sexually mature boys along with them too? And I don't know that the women came to any conclusions, but it certainly was a thorny and complicated question when they started thinking about how interwoven they are into their own families.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, in these communities at 15, 16, you're being baptized into, so then you're a member of the church, a member of the community. And, for the boys, then, they're, in a sense, they're men. And yet we know that a 15-year-old, boy is still a boy, very much a child, moving into, adulthood, but not there yet. And to leave, yeah, I mean, how can you? I mean, it's unthinkable to leave your child behind simply because he's a male of a certain age, considered to be a man by the community, but of course not. So it is something that the women have to figure out, almost in a very kind of pragmatic way, well, what will be the cutoff, because of course, if they do leave, they want to take their children, but will they also be taking their adult male children? It's something that they, and it causes, great pain, can they join them later?
Right.
What will they do? And what will happen to them when they leave? Will they then be, one of the characters says, then will the boys be used, in our place, used to satisfy these, the violent urges of the men, and that I recently received an email from a woman who is related to somebody from that particular colony, photographs of boys who had been teenage boys who had been viciously beaten and whipped, and the photographs are of their torsos showing the marks from the horse whip, and bleeding and bruised and really unrecognizable, the faces of being punched and hit, and these boys apparently had somehow managed to connect with somebody who had access to the internet, to a computer, and where they were able. And so those pictures are circulating now within the Mennonite community. And I mean, the violence within these communities is it's unchecked and condoned and so sanctioned. That the sense that this is how we discipline. We need our members to be obedient, and if this is what it takes, then so be it.
As a sort of counterbalance to all of this, the book is sort of infused with hope and vitality as this almost subtextual love story between August and Ona. But I don't know if I'm reading into it, but that they're united by both of them being somewhat marginal. She's being seen as having NARFA or anxiousness or nervousness, and marginal because of that too. And you've written about mental illness in many of your books. Your dad and sister both took their lives, and you've wondered if the Mennonite worldview that we are born sinners and are only rewarded once we're no longer alive played a role in their suicidal tendencies. And in Bolivia, the female imagination is the first thing suspected when these crimes were reported, that the women are either possessed or crazy. And the bishop of the real colony in an interview said, why would they need therapy if they weren't awake when it happened, because they were drugged by an animal anesthetic? And the main answer I've seen you give around why a man tells the story is that it's time for men to be quiet and listen. So he's not really telling the story as much as he is sitting on the margins and listening and recording. And I guess I wondered if you saw that the women in the hayloft talking and August in the corner writing as a corrective, or the beginning of a corrective regarding this. Absolutely.
Definitely. That August is there for all sorts of reasons, but specifically, to record, to bear witness, to listen and to learn, and then to take that and use it to educate the boys, which is the reason why he's there in the colony, and hopefully he'll be educating girls at some point as well. That's the hope. But I absolutely, as a corrective, maybe untowardly hopeful, but certainly, there is and always needs to be that hopefulness, and I know that I'm not, this is just one book and one small part of the conversation, but I know that there are so many others out there, in Mennonite communities and not in Mennonite communities, outside of Mennonite communities, who are talking about this stuff, and so I am hopeful, and that is the role, that is August's role.
And do you know what your next project is?
It's hard to, again, like I was saying earlier, back to the futility that I have to fight all the time, tooth and nail, in term and trying to. So first of all, I have to deal with that, and then, but I do have, I need to create another story where I give myself a task through the protagonist of the book, a writing task, in order to make it seem like something I need to do. But sorry, I'm rambling, probably in an attempt to, get away from the question, because I find it so hard to talk about this kind of embryonic stuff and the vague ideas, but I'm taking notes and I'm filling notebooks. And so, I'll have to circle. As always, I'll have to go back and look at the notebooks and then see, these are the things, these are the subjects, or this is the story, this is the thing that I obviously need to write. It will become clear to me when I go back over my notes, because I'll have gone, back to that and back to that and back to that.
Yeah. Well, to leave behind questions around what your next book is about, is there a question that you feel like you're circling that is the result of having finished Women Talking? Like either one that you put aside because of writing the book, or one that was produced by the book that you feel like maybe you're circling now?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one thing that's come from this book, and maybe it's something that I kind of, sort of, vaguely, or maybe not on a conscious level, knew that there, the lives of girls and women, and of course, like we've discussed, to a certain extent, boys and men and everybody in these types of authoritarian, religious, orthodox, conservative, closed colonies, and not just colonies but communities. I mean, that's my the older I get, it seems the closer I get to reliving all of that stuff, going back in my mind, and and feeling it, questioning it, wanting to know why this is happening and why we can't, if we are a family, of individuals who are attempting to, live in some, genuinely loving and pacifist way, why we can't attempt to solve some of these, really big problems within our community. I just don't understand why we can't do that. And so I think that, I do understand. I understand, the difficulty, and I understand the need for silencing that the elders and the leaders have, but and the threat to them, but. So I think that, again, even though I've said so many times, I just don't want to write about Mennonites again, I feel as though, and specifically, the conversations that I'm having about this book with people, the topic, again, that what I do next will, I'm almost sure, have something to do with the lives of these women.
It was a real honor to have you on the show and to be part of boosting the profile of Women Talking in the world.
It was a real honor to be here. Thank you very, very much.
We're talking today to Miriam Toews, the author of Women Talking. You've been listening to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's program was recorded at the studios of KBOO. Volunteer-powered, non-commercial, listener-sponsored, full-strength community radio from Portland, Oregon, found at kboo.fm. Miriam Toews has recorded for the bonus archive a reading of a poem by Coleridge, from which she took the phrase, "all my puny sorrows," from one of her novels. This joins supplemental material by Marlon James, Sophia Shalmayev, Layli Longsoldier, Carmen Maria Machado, Sheila Hetty, Forrest Gander, John Keane, Morgan Parker, Christina Rivera Garza, and others. All of this can be found at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. Finally, I'd like to thank Imre Lodbrog and Barbara Browning for creating the outro. Their album, Imre Lodbrog A Sapatita Mi, can be found on iTunes. And Barbara Browning's trove of ukulele covers can be found at soundcloud.com/Barbara Browning.